Hi everyone, welcome to a very special event that we have organised for you tonight. My name is Carmen and I'm a postgraduate neuroscience student here at the University of Glasgow, and I'm also a committee member at the University Psychedelic Society. We had such a positive response in our last event with Professor David Nat, so thank you all for coming to that. And thank you to anyone that's donated to this event tonight. This will give us the option of offering guest speakers a donation, and anything left from tonight will go to the Orchard charity to advance global OCD research, but you'll hear a little bit about that later. The first half of tonight's event will focus more on the clinical research, and then the second half of tonight's session will feature a patient perspective style talk. So we have Mark Drax sharing a very personal journey of healing addiction and trauma with ayahuasca, so do stick around for that. I think that's everything for me. The first half of tonight will be chaired by Niamh, who is also a neuroscience student and society committee member. So Niamh will be introducing our first guest speakers. So yeah, I hope you enjoy tonight's event and thank you for coming.
Our first speaker is Jake Hawthorn, a psychiatrist currently working as a specialty doctor in addictions and general adult psychiatry. He graduated from the University of Edinburgh in 2013 before completing his medical foundation training in Greater Manchester. He then worked in psychiatry in New Zealand for a year before applying to start core psychiatry training in South East Scotland in 2017. He passed the Royal College of Psychiatrists membership exams in 2019 and completed core training in 2020. Jake has been interested in the therapeutic potential of psychedelics since early on in his medical career, and in particular the use of psychedelic-assisted therapy for addiction. Jake is hoping to start a clinical research project in this area in Scotland and contribute to bringing the safe and therapeutic use of psychedelics back into practice.
Okay, hi there everyone. My name is Jake Hawthorn. I am an addiction psychiatrist working at the harm reduction team in the centre of Edinburgh. And I'm going to be speaking today about the benefits and the potentials of psychedelics for addiction. Thank you to Carmen for inviting me along today. It's nice to be with you three in Glasgow. Although my body's here in Edinburgh, my spirit's with you all for this event in, let's be honest, what's Scotland's true capital city. This main photo here was taken by Professor Matthew Johnson. He is a professor of psychiatry and behavioural sciences at Johns Hopkins University. He's one of the main researchers heading up their psychedelic research centre. And I've included this picture just to remind us that when we speak about psychedelics, we're almost always speaking about psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So it's not a case of sending the patient away with pills to take at home, but rather giving the psychedelic in the context of quite an intensive and very well supported course of psychotherapy. A few of the things I'm going to cover today. So I'm going to look at why we think about psychedelics for addiction. Why would we want to give these substances, potentially mind-altering, quite strong drugs to patients that typically have quite a challenging and often unhealthy relationship with substances. I'm going to take a brief look at the first wave of research, which involved a lot of studies looking at the potentials of psychedelics for various addictions, and then going to look at some of the models as to why psychedelics, how can psychedelics help people with addictions. Going to just touch on a couple of patient testimonies because I think they're really powerful, and it's actually sort of these sorts of patient responses, patient feedback that got me really interested in psychedelics in the first place. Going to take a wee look at the recent evidence, some of the more, some of the sort of second wave of psychedelic research studies, and finish with a little like a call to arms of sorts. So why psychedelics? I think most people know that we have a horrendous drug problem in Scotland. These figures came out just before Christmas last year, and these were the 2019 figures. be interesting to see what the 2020 figures are like in terms of how drug deaths went up or went down in lockdown. But yeah, I know the 2021's already off to a pretty bad start. We've had a number of deaths in our caseload. And yeah, I mean, in short, we're bad and we're getting worse if you look at the centre graph there. And I mean, yeah, compared to the rest of the UK, compared to the rest of Europe, I think we've actually overtaken America as the worst country in the world for drug deaths per capita, which is, yeah, really not a great record. But and it's just remarkable how badly we're doing in terms of treating addiction in this country. And yeah, it's clear that we really need something, and I think that psychedelics can really be something for addiction. Recent studies have come out looking at MDMA as psychotherapy for alcohol addiction, and there's a study soon to be published looking at ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for addiction. And yeah, they offer something new that we don't have in our current modes of treatment. So yeah, the old ways clearly aren't working. We need new tools, we need new therapies to help people suffering from addiction. I think it's clear that when they're used alongside psychotherapy, psychedelics can have profound and long-lasting outcomes on a whole range of disorders and difficulties, of which addictions is very much one of them. They offer an alternative to the current methods of psychiatric treatment, whereas things like SSRIs and current sort of talk therapies such as CBT tend to sort of offer symptomatic relief. I think that psychedelic-assisted therapy can get to the root causes of psychological distress and really treat the underlying causes rather than just papering over the cracks, as some of our current treatments do. And I think it's a chance for the Scottish Government to match its words with actions on being a trauma-informed nation. Scotland are quite proud of being trauma-aware, and rightly so. I think it's really important to be trauma-aware, and a relational approach to working with traumatised individuals is really important. It's a really good first step, but I think that it is only a first step. There's a quote that I'm often thinking of in my work these days. It was attributed to the emancipated slave Frederick Douglass, and he said, "It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." And yeah, I think in mental health and psychiatry, particularly in addiction psychiatry, where we're dealing with some extremely broken adults, obviously the best way to go about things, the easiest way to prevent disorders like addiction is to prevent them from happening in the first place. And I think it's really important to be thinking about contributing to a better society where we don't turn out these vast numbers of traumatized, depressed, addicted patients. I think that, yeah, when it comes to it, we can be doing a lot more. We could be sending less people to prison. We know that doesn't work. We could be helping people rather than stigmatizing them and punish them for their drug addictions. And we could be offering support to families in poverty, families in need, and looking to redistribute wealth in society. And I think that would massively help to build stronger children. However, my remit in psychiatry often comes to helping people that are coming out the other side of that, and we're often trying to repair some extremely broken individuals. And I think that psychedelic-assisted therapy can offer us another tool, a much better, more effective tool to help people heal. So I was going to take this slide out because I figured that most people in the Psychedelic Society have a good idea what psychedelics are. However, I kept it in for a couple of reasons. So this chap here, who actually coined the phrase psychedelic, Dr. Humphrey Osmond, he is a British trained psychiatrist that went to work over in Canada. And he was one of the key sort of figures in the early discoveries that LSD was extremely effective in treating alcohol addiction. And I think, the word itself, psychedelic, is important to bear in mind when you think about addicted individuals, it's mind manifest and it's mind revealing. It brings to the surface what people are repressing, what people are trying to wall off, what people are trying to essentially self-medicate and essentially sort of addicts spend their whole life using substances to try and, I guess, not deal with whatever it is they're self-medicating. It's, in my sort of experience, it's often early childhood trauma, physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, and psychedelics can really sort of bring to the surface for people what it is that they've been running from, what they've been hiding from, and allow them to deal with that in the context of a psychotherapeutic relationship. So I guess in the first wave of research in the 1950s and 60s, LSD showed huge promise in treating alcoholism, as it was known then. Dr. Humphrey Osmond came up with the idea at a medical conference in Ottawa. And at that time, that was when the psychotomimetic, that's so easy to say, paradigm was still dominant. So initially, before sort of the psychedelic paradigm, when people realized that it wasn't just a model psychosis, it was sort of something deeper was coming up. There was the thought that inducing a psychotic type, delirium tremens type reaction in people could, I guess, almost sort of scare them into abstinence. And I think it later came to light with some of his research that actually the psychotomimetic paradigm didn't hold so true, didn't hold so strong. And what people were experiencing was actually sort of awakenings, enlightenings, things coming up from their subconscious, things coming up from their past, things that they've been walling off, not dealing with. And it was thought that these awakenings or enlightenings could lead to sobriety. It's worth bearing in mind that a lot of the research from the 90s and 50s and 60s, it doesn't hold up so well to modern scrutiny. There weren't often controls to the tests. The sessions themselves were often poorly supported, sometimes unsupported. There wasn't much in the way of preparation work beforehand or integration work afterwards. But there was this meta-analysis done by, I think they're a Danish couple from 2012, and they looked at all the randomized control trials that they could find from this era. And these were just RCTs that had a single high dose LSD compared to a control. And even in those days, even with the sort of the proviso that maybe research wasn't conducted as meticulously as it is now, they found that LSD was twice as effective as control. And I think that was 325 patients given LSD compared to 211 control, so a decent number they looked at. And their conclusions essentially was, why aren't we looking at this more? Why aren't we using psychedelics to treat addictions? Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, co-founder, he was a huge fan of LSD. He first used it in 1956 with profound results in treating his own alcohol addiction. He said, as you can see here, "I'm certain that the LSD experiment has helped me very much. I find myself the heightened colour perception and appreciation of beauty almost destroyed by my years of depressions." And he was actually keen for it to be included as one of the 12 steps for AA. Obviously, the board weren't keen with that. And he resigned from the governing body a few years later so he could continue experimenting with LSD himself. There's a really interesting book by Don Lattin called Distilled Spirits that covers a lot of this era, and including the friendship between Bill Wilson and Aldous Huxley, who had a lot to say together about LSD. So how do psychedelics work? How can they help people break out of addictive patterns? One of the theories is that they help to disrupt or to bring to light old, ingrained, ruminative, often unhealthy patterns of thinking, and they allow patients to create new narratives. one of the metaphors that's often used these days is that of sort of tracks in the snow, and these tracks become quite well worn, and people keep on going down the same paths, and they get sort of deeper and deeper ingrained, and it's harder to react in a different way. A psychedelic session can be like sort of a deep covering of snow that allows patients to make new tracks and to sort of find new ways of dealing with problems or of reacting to situations. They are highly effective as trauma-focused therapies. This is something that we've learned from the work of MAPS in the States, who are doing a lot of work with MDMA for PTSD. And yeah, they can allow the patients to access and safely process memories that previously they've just not been able to go there at all because it's too painful, it's too raw. MDMA is particularly helpful for this. It can lessen anxiety, it can increase trust between patient and therapist, and patients describe sort of being able to, for the first time, actually go back to their index traumas and speak about what happened to them for the first time. And they're also agents that increase connection. So they can increase connection within different areas within the brain. And some of the qualitative work that's come out of the Imperial trials, Rosalind Watt speaks a lot about this, but they increase the sense of connection to oneself. So people have sort of a great forgiveness for themselves, and they connect to various parts of themselves that they've been hiding from or walling off previously. They increase the sense of connection to others and to the world, and often the universe at large around them. This is just a wee slider board from Drug Science, and that's the famous brain on psilocybin image, which I'm sure you've seen before. And yeah, they talk about a high-dose psychedelic session as being like shaking up a snow globe, disrupting unhealthy patterns of thought and providing an opportunity for them to resettle differently, which is, hugely important in patients experiencing addiction who often have very unhealthy and quite stuck patterns of thought. So just a couple of quotes from patients I wanted to use because I think they're just so profound and so unlike anything that we see in modern psychiatry in terms of either the talking therapies we use or the drugs that we use. So this wasn't specifically an addiction study. This was one of the MAPS patients from a MDMA-assisted psychotherapy session for PTSD. And they said that it feels almost like the inner healer or the MDMA is like a maid doing spring cleaning. It's as if you thought you were cleaning before, but when you got to things you didn't really want to deal with, you just stick them in the attic. If you're going to clean the house, you can't skip the stuff in the attic. So I think sort of a lot of patients who experience addiction they've got a lot of stuff in the attic that they're not ready, they're not willing to deal with, and addiction to substances is one way of coping with that. And as an inducer of mystical experience, so this is sort of a different model, a different way whereby psychedelics can help people, but this is actually one of the patients from a Johns Hopkins University study where they gave high-dose psilocybin alongside CBD for smoking addiction. And this patient said, the universe was so great and there were so many things you could do and see in it that killing yourself seemed a dumb idea. It put smoking in a whole new context. Smoking seemed very unimportant. It seemed kind of stupid, to be honest. So I think that's the idea of sort of potentially connecting to something bigger, getting a sense of connection with the wider universe. And people talk a lot about seeing old problems in a new light, and I think that's a good example of this here. So just going on to have a wee look at some of the more recent studies using psychedelics for addiction. This one was done by a team at the University of New Mexico, and it was essentially a safety, tolerability, proof of concept study. And there were two high-dose psilocybin sessions alongside motivational enhancement therapy, which is a model of psychotherapy that's often used in helping people with addictions. There were 10 patients enrolled, and it involved a 12-week 14-session program, of which 2 of the sessions were the psilocybin sessions. And yeah, you can see from that graph on the bottom right that they were significantly reduced drinking days at 4 weeks, which was the point at which the first dose was given, and these were largely maintained at 36 weeks. They also found that on the mystical experience questionnaire, a greater mystical experience led to a higher chance of abstinence, which is something that's been repeated and found throughout a number of addiction studies, including this one, which was the psilocybin for smoking study. I saw a quote from that, one of the patients from that study before. And this was, again, it was an open label study, it's a pilot study with 15 patients. And the psilocybin sessions were given alongside a course of CBT for smoking cessation, 2 or 3 sessions. And quite remarkable outcomes at 12-month follow-up. 10 out of the 15 patients were abstinent from smoking. And at long-term follow-up, which was on average about 30 months, 9 out of 15 patients were remaining abstinent from smoking. And I mean, I think the rates for smoking cessation is something like, I think you're lucky to get sort of in the high 30s or touched into the 40s at 1 year follow-up for abstinence. So it's obviously it was an open label study. Patients knew what they were getting, but it is quite profound outcomes. And again, a high mystical experience correlates with a greater likelihood of quitting smoking. This one was published just a few weeks ago in the Journal of Psychopharmacology. So this was the first ever study looking at the use of MDMA-assisted therapy for patients with alcohol use disorder. Again, it was a proof of concept study. It's sort of a safety and tolerability thing, so it's open label. There were 14 patients enrolled with alcohol use disorder. And this one followed the model that MAPS used. So it was an 8-week course of psychotherapy, a few sessions of preparation before the first dose, a couple of sessions of integration, second dose of MDMA. And yeah, the important thing to note, it was extremely well tolerated by all participants. There were no adverse outcomes, either physically or psychologically. And that quite impressive graph down the bottom right shows the drop off in alcohol units consumed per week by the patients in the study. At the 9-month follow-up, 9 out of the 14 patients remained completely abstinent from alcohol, and 11 out of the 14 were drinking less than 14 units per day, which is the sort of the maximum recommended allowance. So yeah, what's next for psychedelics and addiction? So a couple of hugely important studies which I think have finished the work and are just sort of in the process of looking at results and should be published within the coming weeks to months, I believe. One of them is a large randomized control trial looking at psilocybin-assisted therapy for alcohol addiction. That's 180 patients, and that's by the team again from the University of New Mexico, who did the initial open label 10 patient study that we saw. And from a team at the University of Exeter, they've got another RCT on the go, and that is 96 patients in total, and they're using ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for the reduction of alcohol relapse. Another exciting development is that Ben Sessa, who did the MDMA trial, or was one of the co-leads and co-therapists, he's recently opened up the UK's first psychedelic-assisted therapy clinic in Bristol, and there are plans to expand these around the UK. I think he's hoping to open up clinics in London, Brighton and Edinburgh within the next year or two. And he's quite keen that these clinics won't just be for private patients. He's keen to sort of facilitate further research and I guess eventually get these therapies on offer within the NHS. There are a lot of trials on the way, several of them from Johns Hopkins University. So there's a couple of psilocybin ones. One's looking at psilocybin-assisted therapy for co-occurring alcohol use disorder and depression, which is hugely common. These things often go hand in hand. There's one for opioid addiction and a study looking at psilocybin for cocaine addiction, which I think is from the University of Alabama. And there is a study on the way looking at ibogaine, which is a West African plant root for opioid addiction and also for methadone detoxification. And hopefully we will be getting things started up in Scotland soon. I'm a huge fan of all the work that's been happening down in Bristol and Imperial College and Exeter and Oxford with the ketamine. But I think it's pretty shameful that we've not got anything started up in Scotland. We need it here as much as anyone else. And as we know, our addiction problems are massive. We've got a huge mental health burden, as does the rest of the UK. And we've got a lot of great institutions. We've got universities, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, Stirling, and I think it's disappointing that nobody's sort of taken this research on and tried to get things started here. So, with that said, we're planning on launching a Scottish psychedelic research group. There's going to be a launch event for this in June of this year. We're going to be based within the University of Edinburgh School of Health and Social Science. And within that is the counselling and psychotherapy department. So I think it's an ideal place to be sitting as a university school. I'm really keen to start some clinical research. I want to look at the use of psychedelic-assisted therapy for addictions, probably either alcohol or opioid addiction, which are both massive problems in this country. Anna Ross, who is the senior lecturer and the researcher who works within the School of Health and Social Science, her background's in law and in drug policy, and she's keen to start some qualitative research in population studies of drug use and public opinion of psychedelic use within the country. She's also an honorary researcher for drug science, and we're hoping to make links with the psychedelic working group to hopefully get some oversight and some supervision and starting trials up here. We're keen. We don't want it to just be an Edinburgh thing. We're keen to reach out to institutions across the country, up and down the country, because there's a massive need for it. So anyone with an interest in psychedelic research, please contact that address at the bottom there. And I guess particularly if there's any millionaires, any philanthropists tuning into this, I would encourage you to get involved, because this work is very expensive. Those are a few of the references and resources I've used, and that's just a silly headline from the satirical news website, The Onion. Feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions or any comments at all. And again, that is the email address for the Scottish Psychedelic Research Group. If not now, when? And if not us, who? Thank you for your time, and I will stop recording now.
Our next speaker is Dr. Simon Ruffell, who graduated with a degree in medicine from the University of Sheffield before specialising in psychiatry. He has an interest in transcultural psychiatry, working overseas with child soldiers in northern Uganda. Simon's primary interest is the use of psychedelic substances in the medical field, namely ayahuasca, and has spent the last 4 years conducting research into the use of ayahuasca in a traditional setting in the Peruvian Amazon. Simon is currently based at the Maudsley Hospital in South London, where he works clinically as a psychiatric doctor, as well as working as a senior research associate at King's College London, looking at the use of psilocybin in treatment-resistant depression. He is completing his PhD looking into the Amazonian use of ayahuasca and its psychological effects at the University of Goldsmiths, London.
Great. So hello, everyone, and thanks very much for tuning in. My name's Simon Ruffell, and I'm a psychiatric doctor based in South London, working at the Maudsley. And I also do research into in psychedelics, namely ayahuasca. And I spent the last 5 years looking at ayahuasca in an adapted traditional framework in the Peruvian Amazon. I'd just like to give a shout out to the other members of the team, Niamh Netsband and Waifeng Sang, who are two psychologists, and we do all the research together. Okay, so a quick overview, and we're going to start off having a think about ayahuasca and tourism, before moving on to our first pilot study, looking at ayahuasca and personality, and then we're going to discuss our latest study, looking at ayahuasca and its effects on childhood trauma and associated mental health outcomes. So to start off, what is ayahuasca? So this is actually a relatively complex question, but put very simply, ayahuasca is a psychedelic plant brew that is used by some indigenous communities in the Amazon rainforest. It's a mix of the Amazonian vine Banisteriopsis caapi, which contains beta-carbolines, and Psychotria viridis, which are the leaves that contain DMT, or dimethyltryptamine. Normally, when we ingest these leaves, ingest DMT, the DMT would be broken down by enzymes in the stomach. However, the beta-carbolines in the Banisteriopsis caapi vine actually prevent this from happening, and the DMT gets absorbed into the bloodstream, and you get the psychedelic effects. So when people drink ayahuasca, they describe profound changes in sensory perception and cognition. They also describe purging, so this could be vomiting, or it could even be things like emotion. They could be crying, letting out strong emotions. They might see things that other people can't. Some people describe this as visions, and they might go within themselves, have a greater degree of introspection, and some even say that they connect with the divine. Ayahuasca has been used for a wide variety of things. It can be used as a medicine and as a sacrament, as a tool for spiritual development, for scientific inquiry. Historically, it was used a lot more for warfare and for hunting. And more recently, it's been used for tourism and pilgrimage. Some say that ayahuasca tourism might be diluting tradition. There's been a massive increase in the amount of people who've been drinking ayahuasca over the last 10 to 20 years, either flying to South America and ayahuasca has also spread around the rest of the world. There's a Western perception of what ayahuasca is, and some believe that this could be creating a demand that isn't necessarily exactly how the original tradition of ayahuasca was, and therefore diluting the tradition. Some have concerns that about the environment, and not only flying to the Amazon rainforest, but the way in which ayahuasca is harvested, that is not done in a sustainable way. It can take about 8 years for an ayahuasca vine to properly grow, and it's not being done, and it's being harvested more quickly than ayahuasca can grow. There have been concerns that it might not be entirely safe to drink ayahuasca. There's no regulatory board for ayahuasca retreat centers throughout South America. And this has led to many charlatans who don't have the appropriate training to set up their own centers or to try and give people ayahuasca in order to make money. And there's a risk of psychological damage and physical harm, and unfortunately, sexual exploitation as well. That's no longer a rare thing to hear of in recent times. And there's actually some guidelines for sexual abuse that's been published on shakruna.net, as well as an ethical code regarding how to conduct ayahuasca ceremonies and the principles that should be followed. Some state that ayahuasca could be used, it could be commodified as a result of ayahuasca tourism. And this could be a case of cultural appropriation in an environment where locals are disadvantaged. When the market is controlled by non-locals, this could be a form of neo-colonialism. Some people even state that ayahuasca tourism might destabilize local communities. This is largely due to the large amounts of money, US dollars that could be coming in to these communities. But having said that, many say that ayahuasca tourism can provide healing and meaning, and also community. Some have even said that it might help to promote and protect traditions that could otherwise be lost as we move forward and have seen in the West when it comes to traditions surrounding shamanism. So we're going to speak now a little bit about our first study, looking at the effects of ayahuasca on personality. So all of our research is done in an adapted Shipibo framework. That's the tribal lineage that the retreat center follows. We work with experienced practitioners such as Don Ronan, who's a local curandero or shaman, and we can see him on the bottom of this slide. The retreat center and research center is based in the Mashana community, which is a community of 80 indigenous people in the Amazon rainforest. There's no mains electricity or phone signal there, and it's 2 hours away from the nearest town, which is Iquitos. The research center is called RIOSBO, and it's affiliated with MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Science. Here we can see the location of RIOSBO Research Center and in the Mashana community in the Peruvian Amazon. So a little bit about the methodology that we used. Our study uses an observational repeated measure design. So we're handing out inventories to participants immediately before their first ceremony and then following their final ceremony after the retreat. And then in order to assess for longer term changes, we also assess participants 6 months later. The retreats normally last for about 12 days. I mean, there are 6 ayahuasca ceremonies, so they're drinking ayahuasca every other day. We also conducted semi-structured interviews, and these have been analysed and published in a separate paper. And this is to provide a more holistic idea of what's going on with participants during ayahuasca ceremonies. So this is an image of the Mashana community. And here is our research center, RIOSBO. So moving on to our sample group. So in this study, we had a sample group of 24 participants, 9 of which were female. It was primarily a Western population, and they'd been vetted by the retreat center, the Ayahuasca Foundation. 12 had problems with their mental health, 14 had problems with their physical health, and 4 stated that they didn't have any problems with either. 6 had tried psychedelics, 6 had not tried psychedelics before, 10 had, and 8 had experienced ayahuasca in the past. We also had a comparison group made up of people who were traveling around South America, but weren't drinking ayahuasca. The reason that we did this was to control for something that we've called the Mallorca effect, which is the idea that traveling to South America, even if you don't drink ayahuasca, might have some effect on you. In order to assess personality, we used an inventory called the NEO-PI3. This assesses personality in 5 different domains in openness and conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And together, these are known as the Big 5. We also assessed participants' mystical experiences. So we used a questionnaire called the Mystical Experience Questionnaire that asks things such as whether participants felt like they were outside of time, and if they connected with nature, and if they had a sense of oceanic boundlessness and things like that. So moving on to our results, we found both in the short term, so immediately after the retreat, and also maintained 6 months later in the longer term, that participants were less neurotic when they were compared to the comparison group. In addition to this, we also found, both in the short term and the long term, that participants were more agreeable. And again, this was in comparison to the control group. What's more, we found that the higher participants rated their mystical experience, the greater the decrease in neuroticism. So it seems that the mystical experience was mediating the reductions in neuroticism that we saw. So a few limitations of this study. So we had limited access to equipment due to the nature of the study being in the Amazon rainforest. There was also no set doses of ayahuasca. It was up to the shaman to decide how much ayahuasca he gave to each participant. Some might say that this was actually a strength because it was an observational piece, and that it wouldn't have been right to measure the amount of ayahuasca that was being given. Unfortunately, we weren't able to analyze the samples of ayahuasca, so we don't know specifically how much DMT and MOAIs were in the brew. And there's a clear self-selection bias here as well. So it takes a certain kind of person to go to the Amazon rainforest and drink ayahuasca. And that can be due to personality. It can also be due to financial status, time off work, things like that. We had a sample of 24 participants, which is relatively small. And there are also some confounding variables in the follow-up 6 months later. So for example, some participants have started engaging in other practices such as meditation or yoga. And so we need to bear that in mind. Okay, so moving on to our most recent study. This is looking at the impact of trauma-related conditions, again, in an adapted traditional setting. I'd just like to say a special thank you to Professor Morgan for supervising this one and for the Medical Research Council for funding it. So here we wanted to look at the effect of drinking ayahuasca on the short and long-term outcomes in relation to mental health and well-being for those who had experienced different degrees of childhood trauma. We also wanted to investigate to what extent overgeneralized autobiographical memory recall and the mystical experience mediated these changes that we saw. So in this study, we had 65 participants. And again, we collected both quantitative and qualitative data. And we can see here on the other side of the slide, we had a more extensive battery analyzing participants immediately before and after their retreats, and then 6 months later for longer term changes. In this study, we were also looking at epigenetic outcomes, and this is looking at the way in which DNA is expressed, so certain genes are expressed as a result of drinking ayahuasca. So we found both in the short term, so immediately after the ceremonies, and then 6 months later, the participants scored less on the Beck's depression inventory. They were less depressed. And again, this was true for anxiety. Participants' anxiety seemed to decrease both in the short and the long term following ayahuasca use. In addition, we found that participants' scores increased in terms of self-compassion, both in the short and long term. And again, we found a decrease in the short and long term in global distress levels. In terms of autobiographical memory recall, we found that participants perceived events that had happened in their life in a more positive light as a result of drinking ayahuasca. We also found some quite weak correlations between the degree of childhood trauma experienced and the outcomes in terms of depression, and also the mystical experience and the outcomes in terms of depression. In regards to the epigenetics, we found that there was a significant change in one of the genes that we looked at, the sigma-1 gene, which has been implicated in memory and also in trauma. However, we need to be cautious with these results because there was only a relatively small sample group in terms of epigenetics. We need to really have hundreds before we can draw any conclusions. So we can't really say if this is a significant result. However, it does suggest that ayahuasca is having some effect on the way in which genes, at least this gene, is expressed. So yeah, further research is needed, and it's an exciting suggestion nonetheless. Before we finish up, I'd just like to ask this question: is ayahuasca research ethical? I think it's important to continue to question ourselves as we move in this field. We can't deny that data is required. There are more and more people drinking ayahuasca, both in South America and all around the world. And so it's important to have data to know what's happening as a result when you drink ayahuasca. There's been a stagnation in new treatments being developed in psychiatry. And, since the turn of the millennia, there's been barely any new treatments. And the new treatments that we do have are largely analogues and new versions of old drugs that we've already tried. Perhaps ayahuasca could give some kind of inspiration as to where we should be taking treatments in psychiatry. Is there, however, a risk of medicalizing ayahuasca? I think most people would agree that they wouldn't want to see ayahuasca in the hands of big pharma. There's a multitude of anecdotal claims all over the internet of people both being healed and harmed as a result of ayahuasca. So it's important that we investigate that to try and understand what might really be happening. Is this just another case of cultural and spiritual appropriation? Is it that people in the West are now having an existential crisis? Have we taken the land and resources of the indigenous over the last few hundred years and are now taking the immaterial? There are also issues to do with oversimplification when it comes to describing things in an ontological fashion. We can't explain everything through a Western lens. I'd also like to mention reciprocity. So the idea of giving back. It's quite difficult to give back in a way that is that's in balance and that's equal, and when dealing with things such as ayahuasca. Money is an obvious one, but it can be quite complicated, just giving money as an exchange for potentially healing knowledge. And there are some websites here that try to address that, such as RAIN. And I'd recommend that you have a look at these websites if you're interested. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. And looking forward to any questions that you might have, and please feel free to email any of the team if you're interested in getting involved. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Jake, for sharing that fantastic presentation, and it's so great to hear that you're launching a Scottish psychedelic research group. And of course, thank you, Simon, some very fascinating research and important points about ayahuasca. For the second half of this event, we will have Annelie, who is also one of our society committee members and undergraduate psychology students. So she'll be introducing our next speakers. So I will hand you over to Annelie.
Mark Drax is an addiction recovery coach trained in England and America and based near London. In 2012, he left commerce in search of a more spiritual and a healing career related to his own journey through abuse and addiction. In 2017, inspired by the work of Dr. Gabor Mate, he ventured to the Peruvian Amazon to the Temple of the Way of Light to take a deeper look inside himself with the help of the hallucinatory effects of the South American plant medicine ayahuasca. Mark now works with individuals and presents workshops on subjects including shame, denial, anger, honesty, intimacy, and vulnerability. His goal is to help clients stop abusing themselves and others, to replace addictive secrecy with healthy, nurturing pursuits, and to rediscover and reclaim their true and original self.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very, very good evening to you. I have been invited to talk to you about my experiences taking the plant medicine ayahuasca. I would love to introduce myself briefly. My name is Mark Drax. I work as an addiction recovery coach, mentoring and coaching men who have been traumatized or fallen upon difficult times in their life, having been traumatized or abused or bullied at school, and who have come to a point in their life where they might have recognized they have a few problems and would love some coaching and guidance to try and put themselves straight. I also take groups and lead groups of men and run workshops for 3.5 days, both in England and in America. I'm going to talk to you today under 4 subheadings. I've got them on my left-hand screen, by the way. I promise I'm not reading emails. And by the way, I'm not in Thailand. That's a funky mural that I inherited when I bought the house. I'm going to talk to you today based on 4 subheadings called Who Am I? So a little bit about myself. Why ayahuasca? Why did I even go to Peru and explore the amazing medicine ayahuasca? I'm going to talk to you about my actual experience in the jungle, of journeying with this amazing medicine and the shaman that I worked with. And then my onward journey, my post-experience, how it's changed my life. So just to kick off, who am I? Because you need to know a bit about me and my background to understand why I found myself flying to Peru at the end of October 2018. I am 53 years old today, and for many, many decades, I have struggled with addiction. I went through some very difficult times as a child, and I was abused, I was bullied, and both by a very abusive nanny who used to beat me regularly, and I was then sent to one of those good old British boarding schools where I was what I would describe today as ritualistically tortured. There's no need to go into the detail of what was done to me, but suffice it to say, it changed the course of my life. That led to me seeing the world through very fearful eyes. Everything I saw, everything I experienced, the people I came into contact with, I was frightened of them at a very deep subconscious level. In reality, it's weird because I'm a 6'8" man. So you would think that a man of 6'8" doesn't have much to be afraid of. And I didn't think I did, but inside I did. And what was I afraid of? I was afraid of people, anyone, especially women, getting close to me and seeing inside me, seeing the person I believed myself to be, seeing the person I'd been told I was, beaten to believe I was for many, many years. So my core belief, as the psychological term will share with you, my core belief was that I'm not good enough. I'm not this enough. I'm not that enough. I'm bad, I'm rotten, anything I do is never going to work. I'm a bad boy, I was the black sheep of the family, etc., etc. I think you get the picture. So with that, carrying that legacy, that fear, that distrust of others, and deep inside myself, which I only discovered quite recently in terms of my life, a deep hatred and an equal hatred and fear of women, because it was a woman who first abused me, my nanny. She used to beat me to hell. I even have living witnesses who have helped me come to terms with this and understand this, who saw it happening at the time, but didn't know what to do with what they were seeing. So that led me into addiction. And when you're not getting the touch you need, when you're not getting the help you need as a child, when you're not being supported as you should be as a child, you will learn to do things for yourself. And aged 11, I learned to masturbate. The trouble with that was, you might think, well, any healthy teenager does this. Well, yeah, they do. But you've got to ask yourself why you're doing it. When you're doing it because you know inside yourself that it relieves and satiates an incredible fear of life, a huge amount of deep inner turmoil, and you start to do this, to masturbate or to drink or to take drugs or to smoke, whatever it is you're doing, whatever it is that you choose as your medicine, to satiate the deep inner fears and pains within yourself, that's what becomes an addiction. You start to do it compulsively. You learn that it makes you feel better, emphasis on the word feel. And of course, guess what? A lovely saying, human beings will never get enough of something that almost works. And ironically and sadly, addiction does work for a while. It does make you feel better. Maybe some of you have experienced this, but the problem is it doesn't last. It's never enough. And you go back for more and more. And masturbation became sex, and sex became dangerous sex, and dangerous sex led me to do some crazy, very dangerous things on occasions, at times over the last 53 years. So with that in mind, and helping you to understand that I became a very serious addict, very lost soul, I was trying to hold down relationships. And of course, guess what? I was destroying every single one. Any woman that tried to love me, deep inside me, I just saw them as a threat. I didn't know this. I didn't know I hated women. I didn't know I was afraid of them. I was trying to go through life with blinkers on emotional autopilot, trying to navigate the world, trying to understand why I was destroying every relationship, but not really caring. I had such contempt for women that I was just blindly move on to the next, that horrible expression, never wait for a bus because there'll be another one along in a minute. Well, unfortunately and tragically, that was my attitude towards women. There are many more out there. So I would betray, I would lie, I would destroy one relationship, I would sabotage, and I would move on to the next, always believing that the next one would fix me. The next one would be the one. This would be my savior. She would be perfect in all manner. And of course, guess what? She might have been superficially, but when it came to letting her get close to me, couldn't do it. So this was my legacy for decades. And unfortunately, it led me to a place with an extraordinarily brave and courageous woman in 2017, when we were trying to have a relationship, trying to make it work. She was a very brave lady and an amazing woman. But I wasn't ready for a woman. I was still a child. Most addicts acting out, doing whatever they do, or seeking whatever they seek to make themselves feel better. They're just basically a child. So how does a child link up with an adult? Not very easily. And this poor lady, she endured until she could endure enough. It led to a place whereby I betrayed and we broke up. And in that year, 2017, I'd stumbled across, through my work, through my trainings, a man called Gabor Mate, an amazing doctor who works out of Vancouver. And I'd heard him talking of this thing called ayahuasca. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to ring the man. I did. And he helped me. And his almost exact words were, Mark, if you've got the time and the money, just go to the jungle and see what happens. You've got nothing to lose. So pretty desperate nearing the end of 2017, with way more questions than I had answers, I got on a plane and I flew to Peru. I went to a place called the Temple of the Way of Light. It's an amazing, safe, secure, beautiful place run by extraordinarily passionate people who have got properly together with the local shaman, working in the jungle, helping them build schools and giving back. The man that set this up well over 10 years ago was so inspired when he discovered it, that he decided to make something for himself and for the locals. And so anyone that goes to the Temple of the Way of Light actually contributes greatly to the local inhabitants. So there I was, the 2nd of November, 2017, in the jungle with that brave girlfriend. She came with me. We tried to work it through. What then followed over the next 3.5 weeks was an experience that changed my life. I was terrified. I'd flown to the jungle. I'd flown 5,000 miles to drink this stuff that I'd read about, I'd heard about. I knew it was likely to cause visions or hallucinations. I'd done my research. I'd read the Temple of the Way of Light's website, which is amazing, but I was still nervous. I've never done drugs. My addiction was sex addiction and all the tragedy that involved. But I'd never done drugs. So here I was about to take a drug, if you want to call it that. I like to call it plant medicine, but fearful of what might happen. Well, I should have been, because what then unfolded through the next 3 weeks was a cataclysmic shift in the dark black matter energy, whatever you want to call it, that had been residing in me for 50 years. It was, if you could think of Star Wars, between the light and the dark. I had been turning to the dark side for a very, very long time. I'd been seeking pain in dark places. So I went to the jungle intent to try and shine a light into the darkness of my soul, to illuminate the pain which was continually disrupting my life and destroying one relationship after the next and leaving me very lonely. On the very, very first session, which was the night of Saturday, the 4th of November, 2017, you lie down on a mattress, you drink, you chant, you set an intention, you work with the shaman. Their chanting is hauntingly beautiful. And they literally move energy around that maloka. Maloka is a word for the giant hut we sat in, we lay in through the night. It started at about 8 o'clock. The ayahuasca would take about 3/4 of an hour to start to take effect. And each night was different. It depended what intention you set. But on one particular night, I shall come back to that. On the very first night, what really set the pace for my then girlfriend and myself was what we saw. The following morning, I'm going to jump to, we were sitting discussing this. And I asked her if she would like to share what she had witnessed, because ayahuasca, in case you don't know this, leaves you able to remember everything. It's the opposite of alcohol, whereby you get plastered and you can't remember anything. Ayahuasca helps you recall. But not only what happened last night, it helps you recall things, in my case, from as early as I could breathe, because it started to show me what was done to me. But that very first night, my girlfriend decided to share what she'd witnessed, and she'd seen, almost like a movie, she'd seen me in an old iron-framed bed at my school, aged 8, being beaten, being attacked, being literally beaten to a pulp by bullies with bars of soap in the end of football socks. And I was screaming, stop it, I was screaming help. She described what I can recall, what I remember, as if she was there. And as she was describing this, my face must have looked pretty strange and got pretty long, because she looked at me and said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Well, I better tell you what I saw last night." She described precisely, to the color of the blanket, exactly what I'd seen, what I'd relived. Now, what might surprise you is that that story had never left my lips prior to that night, prior to her replaying this, my story, part of my life to me. I'd never told the living soul of that particular torment that I went through. So how did she know that? Well, I'll leave you to ponder that. All I can tell you is that what happened to us thereafter, the belief that that extraordinary joint vision conjured for us both, the recognition that this was the real deal, this wasn't hocus pocus, something extraordinary beyond our comprehension was happening to us. And that was the first night, that was the first journey. There were 6 more to come. I spent the following 3 weeks at times coughing my guts out onto the floor of that jungle, screaming, crying, writhing in physical agony on a couple of occasions. The energy, the torment that I'd been storing away in my body, flooding out of me. I could talk for a long time and describe in detail what happened to me. Maybe another time I will, but I don't sadly have time. I want you to know that it was life-changing because of what it revealed to me. The 3 weeks in that jungle was life-changing for all 24 of us in that camp for that particular session, cohort. All of us, without exception, went through extraordinary change, saw things that helped us, opened us, revealed things to us, shook us. Some people had immensely tender, loving experiences. Others, like myself, explored and experienced the pain we needed to experience to finally get our head around what the hell was disrupting our life, but most importantly, where it came from. One night I saw the face of that nanny attacking and beating me as clear as I'm looking at my camera on top of my computer. How did it help? Going forward, what then happened as a result of that, of this whole experience, of this miraculous change to my life? Of course, it's not a miracle. It's real. It actually happened. I can attest to that. As we left, as we geared up to leave the jungle, these amazing guides, some of them English, some of them Peruvian, sat us down time and time again and warned us that the real work probably started when we would get home. We were in a safe environment there. We were very well cared for. We did yoga, we had lectures, we did everything, jungle walks. It was a fascinating 3.5 weeks. It's not just drinking ayahuasca for 2 hours every third night. It's a whole program they put together. And you feel so safe. And when we left and got back to Iquitos, the nearest big town, it was incredibly overwhelming. All the tuk-tuks racing around and everything else, this noise, mobile phones, everything. It was horrible, actually. I missed the sounds of the jungle. What I also missed in particular, I fell in love with nature. I hated it for the first couple of days. Everything that moves bites you. The mosquitoes are the size of pigeons. I mean, it's a pretty wild place, but you very quickly get used to that. And by the time I left, I did not want to leave. I have a recording on my phone of 10 minutes of just jungle noise, which I turned my phone on one night and just recorded the jungle. I still listen to that sometimes because it brings me peace. It showed me that there is a world beyond mobile phones. There is connection. There is connection to yourself. There is connection to other people. This medicine helped move and reveal to me things that had been buried deep in vault-like implicit memories for 50 years. How is that possible? I don't need to know the answer to that. All I know is that it happened. All I now know is that to work with ayahuasca is a privilege. I came back to England. Life for a while, actually, might surprise you, got worse, because now I had all this information. I had the truth about what was done to me. It left me raw. And for a while, unfortunately, I kind of bludgeoned my way on through life, not getting the help I now know I should have sought. My message for this particular aspect of my journey is that it is critical, in my opinion, if you are going to work with this amazing plant medicine, to make sure that when you've done it, when you return home from wherever you go and try it, you must have a good support network ready, at least a good emotionally based coach or a therapist or both, to come back with all that it might reveal and think that, hey, great, I had a lovely time. I now have all these facts to hand, lovely, amazing visions, amazing hallucinations, whatever you want to call them, tick that box and think that it's healed you. I would lovingly say it hasn't. It's revealed things to you. Now you have to decide what you want to do with the knowledge. Knowledge is power, but it's not healthy power if you don't use it correctly. It was an amazing experience. I wish I had hours to talk to you, to describe in detail what I went through on the floor of that jungle. I think the most important takeaways for me, for you, are as follows. If you are struggling with any kind of emotional impasse, doesn't have to be full-on addiction, it can be anything. And you've reached a point in your life where you think, I want to know more about who I am. Not quite sure who I am. When I look in a mirror, can I answer the question, who am I? What are you? When you look at yourself, if you can't answer that question competently, with confidence, with self-love, then maybe you've reached a time in your life where you want to go and explore this a bit more. It's perfect for that. If you are struggling with addiction, with depression, with mental health problems, and you want to just take some time out and go and let Mother Nature connect with you in a way similar to the film Avatar. We talked in the camp a lot about the film Avatar. We noticed great similarities between the home tree, all those things they went through in that amazing film, the connection to nature. I still, to this day, years later now, absolutely love and have a much deeper respect for Mother Nature, our planet, where we live, how we live. It changed a lot of perspectives about all those subjects for me. So I'm an open book. I would answer any question anyone might care to ask me. My name is Mark Drax, and that's D-R-A-X. If you want to contact me, stick my name into Google. You'll find me soon enough. I have a website for my work, and the organizers of this conference we're welcome to put people through to me if you would like to know more. For now, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I hope this has given you just a tiny snippet of my journey with ayahuasca in the jungle, and I hope in some way it helps you. For now, my deepest thanks. I look forward to speaking to you again and maybe hearing from you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Our final speaker is Nick Ciro, a serial social entrepreneur with more than 15 years of experience in medical charities. Most recently, he founded and led a successful consortium developing a treatment for black bone disease, an ultra-rare genetic disease affecting his children. Nick is the chair and founder of Orchard, a charity focusing on developing treatments for patients suffering from obsessive-compulsive disorder, a serious mental illness. Orchard works with clinicians, pharmaceutical, biotech companies, government agencies, patients, and other charities to fast-track the development of new and innovative treatments for obsessive-compulsive disorder.
Hi, I'm Nick Ciro. I am the chair and co-founder of Orchard OCD. We are a charity that focuses exclusively on the research into developing new and better treatments for obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. Now, what I'm going to tell you about over the next 10 minutes or so is really how we, well, first of all, about OCD and how debilitating it can be. And then secondly, about the research that we're funding into psilocybin, the psychedelic, as a potential treatment for OCD, and why we believe it is quite promising, and also how we crowdfunded in order to do this study at Imperial College under Professor David Nutt. Now, I have had OCD on and off for 30 years. Sometimes it's been very, very debilitating with very severe depression, and other times I've had several years without it, and that is called relapsing remitting. But most people actually have OCD continuously when they do have it. It's a very common disorder, affects roughly 2 to 3% of the population. So that's between 1 million and 1.5 million people just in the UK. And 50% of those will have what's called severe OCD, which basically means that they will have these obsessions and compulsions from the second they wake up to the second they go to sleep, you know, so for hours, for 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, 12 months a year, constantly. And it can be really tormenting. So I'll give you an example. Traditionally, people believe that OCD is things such as lining up your pens. You know, people have the expression, I'm a bit OCD, which is actually very damaging because it trivializes what is a very nasty condition. You know, those who have contamination OCD, for instance, will be constantly obsessed about potentially contaminating themselves or others. And as you can imagine, this will have got much worse during the COVID pandemic. And I was speaking to someone the other day who had a contamination obsession, and they would literally wash their hands hundreds of times a day, because when the normal person washes their hands, you get a sense of completeness at the end. In the case of an OCD patient, they will not get that. They will wash their hands will still feel incredibly dirty, this awful sensation that they just can't clean them. And the part of the brain that deals with that is just hyperactive. And so they will keep on and keep on and keep on and keep on, even though it's very damaging. Those with checking OCD, which is also quite a common one, might be absolutely petrified that they will accidentally leave the oven on and burn down the house, and they will check it and check it and check it and not believe what they are seeing, and it'll become compulsive. But in 50% of cases, people do not have these traditional forms of OCD. They have what is colloquially called pure OCD. And this is a form of OCD which is entirely in the mind. So your obsessions and your compulsions are entirely in your mind. And a lot of people with pure OCD can go about their daily lives looking totally normal, very high functioning, and inwardly can be going through absolute hell. Generally, the obsessions are to do with very taboo subjects like sexuality or violence or religion. I'll give an example. I have a good friend who who took his own life because of his OCD. Who used to have a form of OCD called false memory OCD. And in that form of OCD, his mind would literally fabricate false memories, things he had never done and that he could never have done because he was housebound. And it would be awful things like, you know, that he'd molested a child or that he'd killed somebody, and it would create these very strong images. And he would then just obsess for 14, 15 hours a day about whether he'd done it or not, you know, and eventually that drove him to take his own life, which is absolutely horrific, you know. We have another friend who was hospitalized for years in different psychiatric institutions. And it would take her 14 hours a day just to go to the toilet, because on every step of the way, she had to check multiple times that she hadn't hurt somebody, that she hadn't been contaminated, that she hadn't done something wrong. Utterly, utterly debilitating. So these are very, very serious things. And it's been proven that severe OCD can be as debilitating and nasty as schizophrenia. Okay. Now, the problem we have is that OCD research is significantly underfunded. There was a study done by the Mental Health Foundation, MQ, which is based in London, where every few years they will look at how much money is put into mental health research. And it's very low, much lower than for physical illness. But even within mental health research, they have shown that OCD research is the most underfunded, right at the bottom, to the point that only 89 pence per OCD patient per year is spent on research in the UK. So this is completely unacceptable. And that's why we set up Orchard OCD 3 years ago, to focus exclusively on research into OCD and how to make it better. Okay, so that's why we set it all up. Now, one of the things we've decided to focus on is very hard to fund research. So in late 2019, we set up an independent scientific advisory board with some really, really top scientists from around the world, from Stanford University, from Cambridge, from everywhere, and chaired by Stuart Montgomery, who is a very eminent scientist and professor who developed one of the first ever treatments for OCD a few decades ago. And we then did a global call for proposals. And so we had proposals from all over the world. And our scientific advisory board then scored these proposals very thoroughly. And the top 3 were then put to the OCD community. We had hundreds and hundreds of votes. And the one that came right at the top was Professor David Nutt's study, where he was proposing to test psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, as a potential treatment for OCD. So we were very excited about this. And we decided to launch a crowdfunding campaign because, as you can imagine, psilocybin is very stigmatized. Obviously, it is illegal to use for recreational or most other purposes. So very difficult to raise funds for this. And on top of that, it was for OCD, which nobody wants to fund. So we launched a crowdfunding campaign, and we started off with £60,000 that we secured from a trust as matched funding if we managed to raise another £60,000. So we launched this in May last year, and we managed to hit our target, which we were absolutely delighted by. But it wasn't easy. You know, it took a lot of work. We set up a group of volunteers, and we were, you know, for 5 weeks, constantly on the crowdfunding campaign. And after 2 weeks, I received an email from the company which was processing the payments. And they said, we are stopping to process the payments because you are trying to raise funds for an illegal drug. And I was absolutely horrified. And with Professor Nutt, we contacted the company, went all the way to the CEO, and eventually convinced them by showing Professor Nutt's Home Office license that actually this was perfectly legal and perfectly legitimate, and that this would help potentially people with a very nasty mental health disorder. So then the campaign continued, but you can see the kind of roadblocks that you have when you're trying to study a drug such as psilocybin. So we now have the money, and over the past 9 months, Professor Nutt and his team have been setting everything in place to actually do the study. So getting ethics approval, finding a trial site at St. Charles's Hospital mental health unit, finding the right psychiatrists and psychologists with expertise in psilocybin, all these things. And we hope to launch the clinical study at the end of April, when we will start recruiting OCD patients, for the study then to start probably in May or June. And it will be on 20 patients, where they will be given a moderate dose of psilocybin, and there will be then a whole bunch of tests in a very safe, very therapeutic environment to see over time where it leads to a reduction in OCD symptoms. So OCD is generally measured by a scoring system called the Yale Brown Obsessive Compulsive Score, the YBOX, and it is a score out of 40 where a psychologist or a psychiatrist can score the level of someone's obsessions and compulsions. Very severe cases, such as this friend who was hospitalized for years, will have like 39 out of 40, which means they are consumed all day and totally debilitated by their obsessions and compulsions. So we'll be looking at severe cases, which I think is over 16 on the YBOX, or maybe a bit more. And the idea will be for them to be included in this study, and then to see whether psilocybin, that we can detect any help from the drug. Now, this is based on a previous study that was done 15 years ago at the University of Arizona under Professor Marino. And this was a small study that he did on just 9 patients with a number of different doses. And he found that even at the very, very low dose, which was meant to be just a placebo, but which still had some psilocybin, patients were seeing a benefit from the psilocybin and the effects on their symptoms. So we're hoping that this new study under Professor Nutt will also show something. And if that is positive, we will then try and do a much larger study to really show for a randomized control trial that this is an effective drug, and hopefully then be able to get a license for its use in OCD. Now, existing treatments for OCD are really not very good. They are generally antidepressants, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, such as Prozac or sertraline, at very high doses. And in the majority of cases, they don't have much effect, or when they do have an effect, they will just reduce symptoms by maybe 30% or something. The other approach is cognitive behavioral therapy, so a psychological therapy, which has also been shown to work, but which again does not necessarily work for everybody. So there's a lot of patients out there who on high doses of these antidepressants who've gone for cognitive behavioral therapy and who still are not getting better. And it's for those people that we hope that psilocybin will really be able to make a difference. So you'll also know that psilocybin has proved some efficacy in depression, and Professor Nutt's team at Imperial College has done a number of studies on this and has shown that psilocybin is a very fast-acting antidepressant. And so we hope that this will be able to show that in OCD. Now, this is not everything that we're doing at Orchard. We're also doing a study at the University of Hertfordshire under Professor Niamh Feinberg of a medical device called transcranial direct current stimulation, where patients are put tiny little electrodes on their scalp, and a tiny little current, which is barely perceptible, is then put through the device, and we are testing to see whether that will also help with OCD. Now there are other psychedelics out there. I know there are studies being done for instance, for DMT for depression. Ketamine is now licensed, or S-ketamine is now licensed for depression, and is being tested at Stanford University for OCD. So there's a lot of hope in these compounds, but we have to be able to show scientifically that they really work within a clinical setting. And that's what we're trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing that inspiring story. I know everyone listening will have taken something from that. And thank you, Nick. I'm very excited to see the OCD research in future. So yeah, that's everything from us. Thank you all for coming. And of course, any questions you have about tonight, don't hesitate to get in touch. We'll leave our society email in the chat. You can also head over to our social media to hear about any future events, and we're hoping next month we might have climate change and psychedelic event. So yeah, and of course thank you so much to all our guest speakers and all the committee who helped put this event together. So thank you, and we'll see you in the next event.